I want to begin tonight's chat by telling you a story. A story from one of my most favorite novels of all time, written by arguably one of the greatest writers of our time, Stephen King. And this novel is titled 11/22/63. Essentially a date, a very significant date if you know your history. But essentially this novel follows the story of a young man named Jake, set in the United States in America, and he discovers in this diner there's a portal in the pantry. And if he goes into this portal, he can effectively go back into the past, into the year 1958, and he can even effectively change the past and hence the future if he decided to do so. And armed with this power and this time-traveling portal, he decided to stay until the year 1963, the year when the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, would actually be assassinated. Now, Jake believed that if he could prevent the assassination of the president, he could bring about a much better future because this was a great president, and if he can stop such a sinister thing from happening, the future will be very bright. So effectively, he lives in the past until 1963, and he successfully stops the assassin from carrying out the act. And so, very happy, he goes back into the present, yet he's very shocked because then he discovers that the future is actually very different. It wasn't progressive. In fact, his home was in ruins, a war broke out, and because of his one action, he has more or less doomed the future of his country and his life. So again, armed with the portal, he goes back in time to try and reset history. Now, the significance of 11/22/63 is not just the fact that it is a thrilling story about time travel, it is also the idea that actually everything, the whole world, is interconnected. And if you look at causality, actions have significant consequences as they roll on. And that brings us to our talk of tonight, the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect, which is a very quaint term, is essentially this idea that small things can truly have very significant outcomes and goes to show the chaotic nature of our world. It was originally conceived and coined by Edward Lorenz, who is a mathematician and meteorologist. And how he conceived this concept was that in the 1950s, he was actually producing a meteorology report, and he was entering the figures into his weather forecast model. He was supposed to enter a digit along the lines of, I believe, 0.506, and he accidentally entered it as 0.5061. So again, not even 1% in that model, yet the entire forecast became dramatically different. And it was at that moment he realized something, that very small variables can actually significantly affect the ultimate outcome of weather. And in 1963, he published his theory in this paper titled Deterministic Nonperiodic Flow. He theorized that it was very difficult to predict the weather because there was no way for us to truly predict the initial conditions, and also tiny changes in the weather conditions or the atmospheric conditions can significantly roll on to changes, but very unpredictable changes of the ultimate weather that we experience on any certain day. To explain his paper, he explained that if a butterfly were to flap its wings, it could potentially even create a typhoon, because although butterflies are not that strong, but the flapping of its wings can actually produce tiny minuscule atmospheric changes that we're not aware of, which ultimately could affect the overall atmospheric conditions. In other words, these small variables that we're not even looking at, that is very hard for us to really examine, and again, we can't anticipate, they could easily lead to significant changes. Although small, they could even be the tipping point of something that is very, very big. And why the butterfly effect is so significant, and why his theory is so significant, is because it challenges the conventional way of scientific thinking and modeling, where generally we tend to see the world in a very deterministic way, in a very linear way. We have linear models, but our models never account for potential derailment that could be caused by tiny variables that we're not even focusing on. We generally, when we think about, for example, giant changes of things, we usually think that is a giant impact point or a point of derailment. But again, small things like this could effectively change and lead to significant changes, and there's no way for us to model it. And the significance truly has to be understood in the way that we generally think we have a very accurate idea of the world and all these complex systems that we have. But again, it goes to show that they won't be accurate unless we really take into account these potential variables that could exist that are although very small and minuscule, they do have a potential for significant impact. And that was really what his paper was about. And again, in a world that is increasingly more focusing on modeling, at least at the time, with computers and everything, it goes to challenge the accuracy of these systems and models we're building up, and goes to show how a small thing, as small as a butterfly, could effectively change an entire outcome. Now, what Lorenz did with his paper and his theory was not just lead to a change, a revolution in how we see weather forecasting and meteorology, but he actually created essentially chaos theory, a new field of thinking where we start to consider that the world is actually more chaotic than we think because of many variables that exist, many small variables, especially subtle ones, minuscule ones, that could potentially affect the outcomes of many things. Now, his chaos theory and also his butterfly effect theory can easily be seen in almost anything. You can see it, for example, in the world of business, which is ultimately very chaotic. Look at markets from its history until now. All these business competition. We can, of course, have very big and established businesses, but again, minor changes, for example, in how a business operates or even in its entire structure can lead to potentially its demise. Or even in a macro environment on the market, how a small potential startup could cause an entire shift in the industrial landscape and also lead to new paradigms in how businesses are done. The entire business landscape is always in flux as all these variables are interacting with one another, and how something so minuscule, at least at one point of time, usually can roll on to change the entire landscape. And that's why we see the businesses that do not account for this flux, they are the ones that usually are stagnant. They are the ones that try and hold in place with proven models of success, but of course over time they get disrupted as, again, small things they could not predict could fundamentally threaten them. We also see the full force of the butterfly effect and chaos in economics, in the financial markets. Again, if you look back to the 2008 financial crisis, one of the greatest financial crises of recent times, what happened there was not really a conspiracy of people trying to topple the global economy. But what happened there was financial analysts and these banks, they had models where they thought they had everything planned out and charted out with great accuracy, that if they kept lending in a certain way, everything would work out. But again, their models did not account for the potential impact of small compounding factors and variables of the actual lending that happened during the subprime mortgage crisis. Those are the things that, again, the butterfly effect goes to show. All these small things can potentially have great outcomes. Even if you look back to history, you see great examples of the butterfly effect. For example, the bombing of Nagasaki. The United States at the time had actually intended to bomb the city of Kuroku, and because on the day itself, weather conditions affected visibility. So on the day itself, they just decided to change the target to Nagasaki. But again, that small, unpredicted change of weather, which again is a small factor, which ultimately rode on to a bigger consequence, which led ultimately to the bombing of Nagasaki, changed history, especially for the city of Nagasaki, forever. Or you can consider in the early 1900s, a young German artist who was very passionate about art had applied to the Parisian School of Art several times. His name was Adolf Hitler, and were he to be accepted, potentially the outcome of history, of course as we know it in the scale of the entire world, would be very different. And the person that consistently rejected him was a Jewish professor, which ultimately also led to a lot of antagonism from him towards a Jewish community. But again, overall in the point of history, his pursuit of art and the rejection on those days themselves, they might seem minuscule, but these small things could eventually lead to significant outcomes. And what chaos theory seeks to show is that actually, if you think about how you could try and forecast and predict a timeline in the future, it is very hard to see it in a very deterministic way or linear way because there are so many variables. It is truly very chaotic. Many things that we generally don't consider as a potential factor or variable of impact could potentially be that tipping point that could fundamentally shape the ultimate outcome. And the significance of this in relation to forecasting and modeling is that it is truly very difficult. And that's why more accurate models of today, they try to incorporate aspects of chaos theory to try and potentially account for these variables. But again, the significance of the butterfly effect and chaos theory, and why I decide to talk about it tonight, is that we can also apply it into our own lives with two greatest takeaways. The first is that as much as you try to plan your own life, and as we try and chart our future out, it is truly very hard for us to predict and forecast what might actually happen in the future. Certainly in my own experience, but I'm sure everyone can relate. Wherever you are in the point of your life now, probably there are many things that happened that shaped you and affected you. A lot of things that you did not plan for that led to the path that you're on today. And the fact that we experience this collectively, again, is indicative of how chaotic life and the universe and the world really is. Truly, the butterfly effect is always in play. Many things might actually develop that goes against our predictions. Many things could be potentially very chaotic. And there's this continuous flux that's always there, operating in the background, infecting every aspect of our life. That truly the common characteristic of life is actually its chaotic nature. But the second and the biggest lesson, I would say, is also the idea that we have to bear in mind that we generally have this idea that really big and dramatic and booming actions lead to significant outcomes. But what the butterfly effect and chaos theory can teach us is that actually no. Even the smallest actions, the smallest things, the smallest factors, they can ultimately lead to long-term implications of significant proportions. In other words, when we're navigating our daily life, bear in mind that anything that you're doing right now, as of today, as of tomorrow, you might think it might be a small thing, a small habit, a small decision. But these things might ultimately develop to be much greater and propel into something much bigger than you could ever imagine and totally alter the course of your life. In other words, nothing is ever too small. Realize that everything has a potential of significant impact in the same sense that how a butterfly could cause significant atmospheric changes, at least under this chaos theory mentality. The same thing with your life. Any minuscule action that you might be committed to or doing, that could also significantly alter the course of your future. And so ultimately, life, as we know it, can be largely unpredictable and also largely in flux, and in that sense, very wild in terms of its potential ebbs and flows. But at the same time, I suppose one of the greatest linings from this is the idea that you can potentially make a dent as well in life and in the universe, in the world. No matter how insignificant that you think you are, and no matter how minuscule you think your efforts are, these are the things that we should never overlook. Because ultimately, if butterflies have such potentials, then what about us humans?